In October 1983, President and Mrs. Reagan flew to Georgia for a golfing weekend at the Augusta National Golf Course where the Masters Golf Tournament is played. Shortly after 4 a.m. Saturday morning, the President and his wife were awakened by a telephone call from the National Security Advisor, Bud McFarland, who was in Augusta as part of the traveling White House support team. McFarland told the President it was urgent that the two of them and Secretary of State George Shultz meet at once. In robe and pajamas, the President learned that the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States had requested the U.S. to intervene militarily on the island of Grenada, one of their neighbors 90 miles north of Venezuela. They'd been monitoring events on Grenada closely for several days. In a bloody coup the previous week, Grenada's Prime Minister, Maurice Bishop, a Marxist protege of Fidel Castro, who had invited Cuban workers to his country to build a suspiciously huge new airport, had been executed by leftists who were even more radically committed to Marxism than he was. The leaders of Grenada's neighbors, Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Dominica, and Antigua, told the United States that they were worried by what appeared to be a large Cuban-sponsored military buildup on Grenada, vastly disproportionate to its needs. Now that these even more radical Marxists were in charge on Grenada, they had launched a murderous ring of terror against their enemies, and unless they were stopped, the Caribbean leader said it was only a matter of time before the Grenadians and Castro moved on their countries. There were 800 American medical students on Grenada, all of them potential hostages. Under these circumstances, there was only one response Reagan could give to these countries who asked for help. The President inquired of McFarland how long the Pentagon felt it would need to plan and prepare a rescue mission on Grenada. He said the Joint Chiefs believed it could be done in 48 hours. The President said, "Do it." It was decided not to inform anyone in advance about the rescue mission in order to reduce possibilities of a leak that could harm the hostages. The following morning, the group went ahead with their plans to play golf. They didn't want to do anything unusual so as not to tip off the press to the Grenada operation. At the 16th hole, Secret Service agents suddenly surrounded the presidential party, stopped the game, and herded everyone into White House limousines. An armed man had just taken 7 hostages, including 2 White House staffers, to the golf course's pro shop. He was threatening to kill them unless the president agreed to meet with him. Now, normally, President Reagan would not even respond to demands by a terrorist for fear of encouraging only more terrorism. But this gunman was reportedly very unbalanced, and the lives of the hostages were in imminent danger. From the car phone, the president called the pro shop. When the phone was answered, he said, "Hello, this is Ronald Reagan." There was a silence. Then the man hung up without saying a word. They dialed the pro shop again. In fact, 4 more times, each time with the same results. A few hours later, however, the gunman released the hostages unharmed and was arrested. That night, the President and Mrs. Reagan went to bed earlier than usual. At about 2:30 a.m., Bud McFarland called. A suicide bomber had just driven a truckload of dynamite past our sentries and smashed into our Marine barracks at the Beirut airport, killing at least 100 members of the Special International Peacekeeping Force that we and 3 other countries had sent to Lebanon. At 6:30 a.m., they left for Washington for what would become a day of National Security Council meetings in the White House basement Situation Room to discuss the bombings and preparations for the Grenada operation, which was scheduled to get started late that night with the infiltration of commando teams. As the day passed, the news from Beirut became even more distressing. Rescue workers working their way through the rubble had found more bodies, and some of the critically injured Marines died, and the full magnitude of the catastrophe became apparent. In all, 241 Marines had died as they slept, resting from the duties of trying to keep peace in Lebanon. The evidence pointed at both suicide vehicles having been driven by radical Shiite fundamentalists who were bent on the pursuit of martyrdom. This was a group whose leaders promised instant entry to paradise for killing an enemy. The Reagans were made almost speechless by the magnitude of the loss, but their president had to go on with his schedule for the day. It was a day he'd never forget.
The problems are many, the dangers real, the decisions difficult. Indeed, weaker spirits might even be tempted to give way to gloom. But others, like you, Mr. President, are stirred by the challenge.
As you know, our embassy in Beirut was the target this morning of a vicious terrorist bombing. I know there are no words that can express our sorrow and grief over the loss of those splendid young men and the injury to so many others. I know there are no words also that can ease the burden of grief for the families of those young men.